Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 109 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. My name is Jesse Kramer. By day, I work for a fiduciary wealth management firm helping clients all over the country, and by night, I write a blog called The Best Interest. I podcast here on Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where I simplify complex ideas about personal finance from investing to taxes to retirement and beyond. Today, we've got a fun episode for you. I asked a few other terrific financial creators to share a funny story or a cautionary tale from their own lives, specifically about the idea of spending money. Perhaps it's a keeping up with the Joneses type story, or a total misunderstanding of how the world works, or a painful lesson learned, or even in one case, I know, a question to ask of all you listeners. The point is, our choices to spend or to save, they're some of the most basic but most fundamental choices in our financial lives, right? Spending and saving is this foundational principle. We can't talk about Roth conversions in retirement unless we're first making prudent spending choices and abundant saving choices along the way. But before we get into that content today, we have a review of the week, and I want to tell you 3 quick stories somewhat related to spending, at least 2 of them are. So first, our review of the week. Shane Imler left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. He says, "The complete package. I found Jesse through another finance-themed podcast, and I'm glad I did. He has a way of breaking down complex financial topics into digestible, easy-to-understand conversations. His humor and personality make him likable and, more importantly, relatable. Whether you're a finance pro or a new investor, you should subscribe to his podcast, and don't forget to check out all the articles on his blog." Shane, thank you so much for those kind words. And yes, listeners, if you haven't heard, I now have a new batch of super soft t-shirts specifically branded for personal finance for long-term investors. They're no longer the Best Interest branded shirts, but instead personal finance for long-term investors shirts. So Shane, you have one on the way. Shoot me an email. Make sure I have your name and address, which I believe I already do. And I'm going to get you hooked up with one of those new super soft t-shirts. So that's exciting. And another not quite normal, but also just exciting news. I want to share a quick success story, a win-win story that I think proves the concept of what I'm trying to do here on the podcast. And I wanted to share it with all you listeners. So a listener, Paul, he reached out to me in January. And Paul's brother, we'll call him Peter, although I'm intentionally keeping him somewhat confidential, his identity confidential for now. Peter works for a big tech company, think Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc. And like many longtime employees of those big tech companies, Peter has a lot of restricted stock units, stock options, some vested stock in that company, plus he has a large salary paid for by that company. In other words, so many of Peter's financial eggs are all tied up to this one company's basket. And that's a really big risk. And with retirement probably within 5 years or so, ideally for Peter, there's a lot of work that he has to do to ensure that his retirement plan is set up for success. So Peter went to Paul, his brother, who's our listener. Paul's our listener. And Peter knows that Paul loves personal finance, and he went to ask him some questions. And Paul gave him some answers, including sending Peter some of our podcast episodes here. And Paul also said, "Hey, Peter, why don't you reach out to Jesse directly? He helps people like you." So Peter and I started a conversation, and over a couple months of good conversations, that led to Peter now working with me full-time as a client. And the reason I'm sharing this story with you listeners is because that's the virtuous cycle that I'm hoping for here with this podcast. This is super fun for me to produce and talk into this microphone. It's awesome to interact with you all via email, to answer your questions on the AMA episodes. But as you know, I don't run outside advertising. I'm not pushing book sales on you. I don't have affiliate marketing relationships. The one and only way I support this podcast financially, and the way I support my family financially, is by working with clients all over the country, here from Cobblestone Capital Advisors in Rochester, New York, right? We're a fully fiduciary, independent wealth management firm. We solve complex financial questions for the individuals and families who we work with. So Paul, thank you so much for listening and for thinking of me and helping out this business model, if you will. At least, it's working the way I'm intending it to work. Peter, thank you for coming on as a client if you're listening. My vision for the podcast is that it'll always stay free and very high density in terms of the helpful content to everybody out there listening. So if you or someone in your life is seeking trusted expert financial advice, I hope you'll continue to think of me. Okay, on with the show. Before we get to everyone else's spending stories today, I want to share 2 powerful stories that I learned from clients from my work recently. If you read all my blog posts, you actually probably saw this blog post last month, but I wrote this recent article. It's called Scar Tissue, and the link to the article is in the show notes. So if we think of a deep wound, a terrible burn, the remnants of life-changing surgery, that's scar tissue, the body's natural way of healing after an injury. I had to look this up. So when skin or other tissue is damaged, the body produces something called collagen fibers to close and strengthen the wound. And that repair process results in scar tissue with an appearance and a texture different than the original tissue because it's laid down so quickly to heal from the wound and without the original structure of our normal skin. Physical scar tissue, it does carry some sort of memory component with it too. The same event that burned us or cut us can create some emotional, psychological wounds, or quite often, a particular event might not leave any physical scar tissue at all, but it creates this deep memory scar tissue. I don't know if you all listening remember this, but at the end of 2022, there was a terrible blizzard in Buffalo, New York that killed, I think, 40 or 50 people. And I was actually caught driving in that blizzard, or actually in the early hours of that blizzard. And I have no physical damage, thankfully, from the blizzard, but there's a mental wound in my brain that gets very hyperactive when I'm driving in the snow, kind of like, your uncle's knee that aches when a storm is on the horizon. Those mental scars, right, forged from some sort of intense or traumatic experience, they shape the way we think, the way we react, and the way we feel long after that proximate event itself has passed away. The scars can protect us in some ways, making us more cautious for future events, but they also limit us if we never learn or heal or reframe the story behind the scar. If you've educated yourself enough on personal finance and investing, you know that money's mental and psychological aspects probably matter much more than the numbers do. I'd argue that most people I speak with struggle more with the mental and the psychological than they do with rational arithmetic. But sometimes you need to hear a firsthand account, a real story for that fact to sink in. And back in May, I was blessed to hear 2 stunning anecdotes of this type, and I want to share those anecdotes with you. So the first one is from an elderly lady I met with, just this delightful woman, very kind, very funny. She was born in the late 1930s, so just on the tail end of the Great Depression. And by the time she was 16 or 18 or 21 years old, those kind of ages where we really start to shape our personal worldviews, and the Great Depression had been done and dusted for a couple decades. But I'm sure, even though maybe she didn't realize it as a child, the echoes of the Great Depression surrounded her. She was swimming in it. And if we think of the adults and the role models in her life and their experiences as adults in the Great Depression, it starts to make sense. Those echoes, those lessons, those fundamental changes in American life all informed the person that she grew up to be, and in some way, they inform the person she is today in 2025. Now, regarding financial planning, she and her family saved and invested wisely for many, many decades. And here she is in her late 80s, living off less than 1% of her portfolio assets every year. And as we've discussed here on the podcast and I've written about on the blog, living off of 1% per year is very, very, very low, and doubly so for someone her age. And yet, despite that mathematical fact, this woman looked around the room at her children in a meeting with us and looked at my colleagues and looked at me, and she said, "Thank you all for what you're doing, but I just want to make sure you guys really understand, I do not want to run out of money." So if all we do is look at the math, we'd think to ourselves like, wow, that's kind of a silly thing to say. Someone withdrawing 1% per year, let alone someone who's 85 plus years old withdrawing 1% per year, they will never, ever, ever run out of money. But if we pause and zoom out, remembering where she came from and what she's been through, the light bulb goes off. Aha. This is Great Depression scar tissue. It's still there 85 years later. Not an opinion. It's there. It's fact. It's very real to her. And we might think to ourselves, well, the numbers just don't justify feeling that way. And sure, I agree with that. The numbers alone don't justify her concerns. But that memory scar tissue, it didn't just manifest on its own. Just as with a real scar, it got there through some sort of burn or cut or traumatic injury, right? Traumatic. This woman's concern, her memory scar tissue, is born out of real financial trauma from the Great Depression. It doesn't just disappear with a few off-the-cuff lines of retirement math. And the second story along those lines comes from a 45-year-old man, as nice and humble as you can imagine, the very salt-of-the-earth kind of guy. 25 years ago, he started his career in a blue-collar, technical, manual labor field, and he just worked, progressed one step at a time. And now for the last couple of years, he's been managing his entire company's manual labor workforce of 1,700 employees. So serious progress. But to explain where he came from, he told me this story. He said, I'll never forget it. Our daughter was young at the time. We were in Wegmans grocery store. I walked over to the meat department. I got one of those packages of chicken breast. I put it in the cart, but my wife stopped me and she looked at me and she said, I'm sorry, honey, but we can't afford chicken. So just imagine that, listeners. What did that chicken cost? But the budget was tight, right? Kids are expensive. Income was hard to come by at the time. And you fast forward to today, he's leading a team of 1,700 employees. His compensation definitely matches his responsibility. We're talking easily within the top 1% of all earners in the country. Hard work is really paying off for him. He's the kind of guy who deserves it. But he admitted to me, he goes, I'll never forget hearing that we couldn't afford chicken. And sometimes I still feel like that's my relationship with money. Okay, so once again, we might think, well, the numbers just don't justify feeling that way. And once again, I would agree, the numbers alone shout out, you know what, man, eat nothing but chicken for the rest of your life, you'll be fine. But his memory scar tissue, it didn't manifest on its own. It got there through burns or cuts or traumatic injury, traumatic. So I'm not sure if it was disappointment or sadness or shame, a combination of those things, maybe a different emotion altogether. But the feeling that you can't afford a quote unquote simple grocery item for your family, that feeling sticks with you and it leaves a mark. And even as life goes on, the financial floodgates might open like they did for this guy, but the scar tissue still sticks around. So then I think to myself, well, what about you listening? And what about me? And I mean, we don't have any financial scar tissue, right? Well, we're going to jump from scars to ophthalmology. It's not that I'm becoming a medical expert, but I do know this. We all have two blind spots in the middle of our visual field. The optic nerve blind spot, I had to look this up. It's a small area on each of our two retinas where the optic nerve exits the eye. It contains no photoreceptors and therefore is incapable of detecting visual information. And the great irony is that most of us are ignorant, or blind, you could say, to those blind spots. Most humans have gone their entire lives without realizing that they have blind spots in their visual field. Yes, you listening, you have two blind spots in your visual field. And I'd argue that most of us, you listening at home, me talking to this microphone, the two people I talked about before, we go our entire lives blind to our own financial scar tissue, blind to the trauma, blind to the long-lasting effects that define our very lives, define the way we choose to spend money or not spend money. We make daily financial decisions as a function of those long-held beliefs. Some are logical and maybe well-thought beliefs, but other are a function of pure financial trauma. Yet again, this is one of those times where I want to call upon David Foster Wallace's speech, This is Water. Longtime listeners, longtime readers know it's one of my favorites, especially the opening story, The Parable of the Fish, where David Foster Wallace says,
there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, morning, boys, how's the water? And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, what the hell is water?
We're so immersed in it, we forget it's even there. Or as Wallace said, the most obvious and important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about. Just like our blind spots, just like our scar tissue.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Did you know my written blog, The Best Interest, was nominated for 2022 Personal Finance Blog of the Year, and it's been highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, and on CNBC? I love writing, especially when that writing is to share financial education, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles per week. You can read them all at bestinterest.blog. Again, the web address is bestinterest.blog. Check it out.
So thanks for listening to those stories. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. And now let's get to some of our awesome guest contributors today and start with their stories. So for the first one, let's pass it off to Joe Saul-Sehy from Stacking Benjamins for his hilarious minibar story.
Hey there, Jesse and personal finance geeks. This is Joe Saul-Sehy from Stacking Benjamins, and I have a story that didn't kill me. It was a fantastic time with money. I was dating this wonderful woman at the time. I'm from farm country, West Michigan. I'd never been to an upscale hotel, and this woman I was dating was fantastic. By the way, now we've been married 32 years. And I decided I was going to invite her to go to Chicago with me. And I found this beautiful hotel just north of all the bars, which was called at the time the Claridge House. And it's in this kind of brownstony neighborhood, beautiful place. And we pull up And of course, I immediately see that the parking's going to be a bunch of money, and the money that I really don't have. And I could barely scrape together the money for the hotel room, but I really wanted to impress this fine young lady. And so I figured it all out. We get up to the hotel room and everything looks great, but there's a refrigerator. And so I walk over to the refrigerator while Cheryl is getting ready to go out this first night in Chicago. When she comes out, I've got some macadamia nuts and a Bud Light, and I'm watching the football game. And Cheryl said, "What are you doing there?" And I said, "It's amazing. There's this refrigerator in our room that's just full of snacks." And she said something ridiculous. She said, "I think you have to pay for those." And I said to her, "I don't think you know how much I paid for this room." Because in my mind, there was no way that, of course, that they were going to charge for this. Well, what was really cool was not only do we go out and we have a wonderful time at this jazz club and at dinner, we come back and not only do they have little chocolates on our pillow, but they've restocked the Bud Light and the macadamia nuts from the refrigerator. So the next morning we go out to the museums, and before we go, I grab some potato chips, I grab some M&Ms, and a couple bottles of water. And then we come back. Those have been restocked. We had the best weekend. But the next day, as we're getting ready to check out, and of course, we've been married now for 32 years. This is before, maybe you could do some type of phone checkout, but I thought you had to stand in line. So we get our suitcases, we begin to leave, we get to the elevator, and I all of a sudden got this idea, because I'm a pretty money savvy guy and I don't want to waste money. I said, "You know what? You go downstairs and I'll be right back." She goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, I forgot something. I'll be right back." So I go back to the hotel room and I take my suitcase. I unzip it right in front of the refrigerator, and I take my hand and I just pile everything in the fridge into my suitcase. And I zip it back up, and now I'm getting a ton of value out of all this stuff. So I go back down and I wait in this super long line to check out. We waited forever, and Cheryl's just over sitting in the front window of the hotel watching the cars go by and pedestrians. And I finally make it up to the front, and the woman says, "Well, how was your stay?" And I said, "Oh, this place is amazing. We had the best time. Thank you so much." And then she said, "Did you enjoy the minibar?" I thought to myself, what business of yours is that? But I'm a pretty polite guy, so what I said out loud wasn't that. I said, "Well, thank you. We enjoyed it very much." And then she says, "Well, I've see here the purchases you made the first 2 days." And then she takes out a piece of paper and said, "Would you kindly list here all the other things that you had?" And I see those. This is 30 years ago, and the M&Ms were not 75 cents like they were at the store at the time. They were like $3.50. This Toblerone, I'd never had Toblerone, was like $5. Those little Jack Daniels things, $6, $7, $8. And I've got all of it in my suitcase right next to me. And there's this just pit in my stomach because I was really struggling with money. And I don't know what I'm going to do. So I look at this list, and then I look down at my suitcase, and I look back at the list again, and I look back at my suitcase again. The guy behind me coughs because he's been in line every bit as long as I've been, and I'm clearly just wasting time. I look over at Cheryl, and she's just giving me the what's up look. And then I look at the woman, and I thought for a second, and I said, "I had all of it." And she goes, "Excuse me?" And I said, "I had all of it." And she was super professional. Her mouth only went up for like a quarter second into this unbelievable smirk, like this laugh. But then she went, "Okay, very good. Just sign here on the bottom and we'll just charge it to your card." And as she is putting in these expenses and getting me my receipt, I'm just praying, "Please let my card go through. Please let my card go through." And I blocked out exactly how much money it was. But that day we had Toblerone all the way home, and potato chips and more macadamia nuts and a Snickers bar. And it was a fun drive back to Michigan, but it wasn't fun paying that bill later. So there's my stupidness with money. Turns out the minibar, Jesse, isn't free.
How many times in your life have you spent money without even realizing it? Have you ever been so embarrassed about something that you simply accepted your fate rather than trying to maybe find a way out of it? Have you ever eaten a Toblerone candy and washed it down with a mini bottle of Jack Daniels? Thank you, Joe, for sharing that story. And I think a good takeaway here is that very few things in life are truly free. And if it seems too good to be true, that might be the case. Okay, now let's hand it off to Justin Peters, host of Fi-Minded.
Hey, listeners of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I'm Justin Peters, host of Fi-Minded, a podcast for people chasing financial independence and having fun along the way. Jesse asked me to share a spending story. I definitely had my fair share of keeping up with the Joneses moments, but today I want to go a little bit different direction and tell you about a situation that taught me an unexpected lesson. It was fall of 2024, and I heard a bunch of noise outside my house. I stepped out and saw a construction crew putting up no parking signs right in front of my place. I live in a neighborhood with no restricted parking, so I asked one of the workers what was going on. Turns out the city was installing a crosswalk. I was a little annoyed because this is where I usually park, and I hadn't received any notice, but I brushed it off. That was until the weekend. I had just picked up a piece of furniture, and when I got home, I realized I couldn't unload it on my own. I called my sister, and she said that she could come help me in 20 minutes. So I parked halfway in front of my driveway, halfway in the new no parking zone, and I went inside to wait for her. When I came back outside, there was a parking ticket on my windshield. I was so furious. Those signs had literally just gone up that week. The curb and the crosswalk weren't even painted yet. I was mostly blocking my own driveway, and I'd only been inside for maybe 30 minutes. I thought to myself, well, there goes $50. Later that night, I went online to pay the ticket. There wasn't a cost on the ticket, so I was expecting about a $50 fine. And instead, I found out it was $512. Apparently, since I was blocking a crosswalk, I was cited for impeding the mobility of the disabled. Yeah. I was fuming and ready to fight. But I ran into an issue. I'd been driving my girlfriend's car, so the ticket was in her name. Whenever I called her and told her about this, she didn't want anything to do with going to a courthouse and contesting the ticket, which is honestly totally fair. It was my mistake and my problem to deal with. So I did some digging, and to contest it, I could have completed an affidavit, got it notarized, and then scheduled a court date, which of course had limited daytime hours. I think it was something ridiculous, 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. with a 12 to 1 o'clock lunch hour. So I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to find some time during the day to go and take care of this. But I was ready. I was gonna go full crusader and get this parking ticket reduced. But that's when my girlfriend asked me a very simple question. Is all that time and energy worth it? At first, I was like, oh, hell yeah. I was so defensive. I felt so wronged. A $500 parking ticket, parking in front of my own house for a crosswalk that didn't even exist yet. But then later that night, I started thinking about it. I was already overloaded and stressed with other things that I needed to take care of. And the whole process I know would have drained me. And honestly, there was no guarantee that I would have won. I think I had a legitimate case to prove, and hopefully I could have got it reduced to a normal parking ticket, but that wasn't guaranteed. So what did I do? I paid that freaking ticket the next day. Sure, I still grumble about it now and then, but as soon as I hit the pay button, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't put myself through all of that hassle. That's where the lesson comes in. Sure, I recognize that this comes from a place of privilege. I had the financial means to make a problem go away. But that isn't something I normally do. I usually go out of my way to save money, even if it means inconveniencing myself. But this experience showed me something important. As I gain more financial freedom, there are moments when it's okay to let go. Since then, I've been experimenting with spending a little bit more on convenience. Just last week, I paid extra for a later flight so I didn't have to wake up at 4 a.m. My younger, super frugal self would have been absolutely horrified, but my future self, the one that's trying to find balance between financial optimization and enjoying life, would be proud. Jesse, thanks for giving me a chance to share my spending story. And if you're listening and you want to find a healthier balance between your money and your happiness, come check out my podcast, Fi-Minded.
Now, it's not a perfect correlation, but it seems that many younger people feel like they have enough time, that they're comfortable sacrificing time or sacrificing convenience in exchange for money. Like Justin's example, a person might gladly take the earliest flight possible to save $50. But as we age, and likely as life or careers or relationships get more and more time consuming, our internal calculus of time versus money starts to change. Personally, if I knew it would cost me 1 or 2 hours, would I go to court to explain Justin's parking ticket snafu for $500? I mean, I think I probably would. Would I trade an hour for $500 or for the potential of saving $500? Yeah, I probably would. But if it was $50 or $100 ticket, no way. I don't think I'd do that at all. I mean, my go-to example that's very obvious to me, at least, when I hear is someone is willing to drive across town for cheaper gas. So they'll spend 10 minutes in their car, they'll drive 5 miles to save 15 cents a gallon, which is what, $2 on a fill-up? Your 10 minutes is worth way more than $2. And I bet if we each paused and thought about it, we could find some places in our lives where we don't value our time and convenience enough, and we ought to be spending a little more money to save ourselves a little more time. Even a big celebration, would you spend a little extra money to celebrate the big special moments in life? Now, for that question, let's pass it off to Jordan Grummett, aka Doc G, from the Earn and Invest podcast.
Hi, I'm Jordan Grummett, aka Doc G, and this is my money story about keeping up with the Joneses. I grew up in an upper middle class neighborhood, and because we were surrounded by wealthy people, we were used to this idea that you spent a lot of money on houses and cars, and you spent a lot of money on restaurants. In fact, one of the most expensive restaurants in our area was one of the few that I think was rated 5 stars. It was called Le Français. And Le Français was the place to go to get the best meal. And when my stepsister graduated high school, she asked for her present to be a family meal at Le Français. Now, this was back in the 1980s, and probably would cost around $400 to $500. A lot of money, certainly at the time, but not particularly prohibitive for my mom and my stepfather, who both owned their businesses, who saved 50% of their income, and were well on their way, if not already, at financial independence. So keeping up with the Joneses in this case was no big deal. We could go to an expensive restaurant, just like our next door neighbors, by the way, who owned 2 Bentleys. But there was a catch. You see, my mom is the child of a woman who lived through the Great Depression in an orphanage and never had enough money. And then my mom was married, and the main breadwinner in our family, my father, died. And so my mom had a lot of money trauma, both generational from her mother, as well as lived from the loss of my father. So even though years and years after my father died, she had remarried, we had accumulated a decent amount of wealth, the idea of spending that much money to go to a restaurant was painful and anxiety-provoking. And I remember for the weeks leading up to this dinner, my mom had serious reservations. In fact, it was unclear whether she would even go up to the last minute. We all eventually did, and the dinner was lovely. And then we moved on with our lives, and it didn't have a huge impact on our wealth. In fact, it had 0 impact on our wealth. It was one splurge, one day where we spent more than we normally would to celebrate my stepsister's graduation. Years later, I think a lot about my own ability to spend. Often I have trouble spending money too. I have the same generational trauma. I remember my grandma hoarding money. I remember my mom being anxious and worrying about running out. And so for me, spending money is really, really hard. It's not that I'm so connected to my net worth as being that important. It's just I was brought up with this idea that things aren't that important and you shouldn't spend money needlessly. Now, I've gotten better at that, and we live a life where we spend a lot of money by necessity. We are lucky we have a high enough net worth where we can do that. But I often think back to that dinner at Le Français when I get anxious about spending, and I tell myself that occasionally it's okay to spend money, even more than you had planned. Occasionally, it's okay to keep up with the Joneses. Occasionally, it's okay to do what other people in your area are doing, especially if it is brief, if it's one time, if it's not going to hurt you in the long term. What it made me realize is it's not the one-offs that get us in trouble, it's the habits. And so you can sometimes spend frivolously as a one-off to do something that lights you up or celebrates a family member or creates a moment that you'll always remember. And those one-offs are fine. The people who get in trouble are the people who have a habit of keeping up with the Joneses, a habit of spending too much. And by nature, I will never be one of those.
I love that quote. It's not the one-offs that get us into trouble, it's the habits. What an awesome takeaway. Now, do you have any habits that you think are quote-unquote keeping up with the Joneses? Or going back to the scar tissue example that I was telling you, do you think you might have some blind spots that are kind of Jonesy in nature? It's a little bit of a scary question, and it might be worth consulting with your spouse or a friend or a colleague to get their input on that one. But there might be another side to that story too. Can we be blind to our own frugalism or blind to our own minimalism, blind to our own cheapness, so to speak, to our own deep down desire to spend much, much less? For that, let's pass it off to Diania Merriam, the founder of the Economy Conference and the host of Optimal Finance Daily.
Hi, this is Diania Merriam, creator of the Economy Conference, which is a party about money designed for the FIRE movement. So my philosophy in general is that the less materialistic I am, the more idealistic I get to be. And that has served me very well. I also really like the idea of stealth wealth. Like, no one would ever look at my house and my car and my material possessions and think that I had money. I very much enjoy being underestimated. However, I am not completely immune to the perils of consumerism. And I certainly have moments where I feel like my house is dumpy or I feel insecure about my clothes or whatever, right? I'm human, just like everybody else. And right now, I am dealing with this as it relates to my car. So I love my car. It's a 2010 Mazda 3 that I bought for $6,000 cash in 2018. When you think about like keeping costs low for a car or like optimizing car costs, I think it really boils down to like how you've engineered your life to drive less, or that's how it's worked out for me. And so I don't drive very much. Like, I work from home, I go to the grocery store. I mean, I certainly drive around, but I don't drive much. And I've only put maybe 40,000 miles on this car in the last, 7 years? So I love this thing. It's served me very well. I've done routine maintenance. I've never had any issues with this car. And it's a rebuilt title, but it's great. The thing is, there must have been a time that when I cleaned the dashboard, I used maybe a cleaner on it that I shouldn't have used on the dashboard. And with the sun beating through the windshield, it created this like sticky dashboard. And I have pets. I drive around my dog everywhere. And so this sticky dashboard is now like covered in like fur and dust, and it just looks gross. And I am so tempted to buy a new car just because of my sticky dashboard. I would say this is an example of me feeling like peer pressure to buy something because the car is very functional. And in general, I really value function over aesthetics. But in this case, it just looks so gross. And I don't want anyone in my car because I feel like they're going to judge me for my sticky dashboard. So the reason why I tell you this story is mostly as a desperate plea. I've gone down Reddit rabbit holes to like figure out how to fix this sticky dashboard situation. And there's apparently no solution to it. If you have dealt with this and you figured out a way to fix it, please, please, please contact me. Or if you see me driving around in a new car and you thought that I was all about stealth wealth and not buying things that I don't need, now you know why.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I love getting your questions, and some of you ask me questions about the wealth management firm I work for in Rochester, New York. Others ask about the Best Interest blog and this podcast, Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, which operate without advertising, without pushy sales, and with no paywalls. How can the blog and podcast stay afloat without me dumping my own money into it? Well, to answer both those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you are actually helping and can continue helping these projects carry forward. So if you've ever been curious about the business of my blog and podcast, or if you're curious about my day job in wealth management, please check out episode 78 and let me know what you think. What is a sticky dashboard worth? Perhaps more importantly, what's it worth to you? A lot of the spending and saving questions come down to that type of question. What's this thing worth to you? It could be a bigger house or a nicer car. It could be dining out. It could be going on vacation, being fashionable, hanging out where the cool cats hang out. There's nothing wrong with saying that something in life has a lot of value to you and that you want to spend more money on it. But we can't say that everything has that much value to us. We can't spend all our money and all those things such that we end up not saving a single penny. But Diana is showing us some of the opposite side of that coin. There's nothing wrong. In fact, there are many things right with stealth wealth. It's that iceberg principle, right? Wealth is what you don't see. Morgan Housel says it's the cars not purchased and the diamonds not bought. It's the renovations postponed, the clothes foregone, the first class upgrade declined. It's the assets in the bank that haven't yet been converted into the stuff you see. That's wealth. But is wealth also the dashboard that you left uncomfortably sticky for years and years and years? Going back to Justin Peters' story, perhaps there's a season in life when you simply accept the sticky dashboard for what it is and you continue to save. But I'd argue there are other seasons of life where the sticky dashboard or the t-shirt that's ripped and falling off your shoulders or the insistence upon only buying the bargain cuts of meat at the grocery store, there's a later season of life where those habits don't really do you that much good anymore. I listened to an episode of Bigger Pockets Money the other day, and the two co-hosts, Mindy and Scott, they're both very financially successful by any metric. They were chatting about how they're likely to never sell a single share of any stock or stock fund that they currently own. And instead, they're going to live off the dividends from those stocks. They're going to live off the income from their real estate investments. They'll work part-time in some capacity forever. They'll never need to sell any stocks. And I understand the part of that statement or that idea, which can be a point of pride, so to speak. You know, it takes a lot of time and dedication and saving in order to accumulate that kind of wealth. But as I listened to Mindy and Scott, I did find myself asking, well, then what's it all for? If you've reached the season of life to consider selling stocks to fund your lifestyle, but you decide not to, then what was the point of those earlier decades of scrimping and saving and building that portfolio up? There's a famous quote in economics by Stiglitz, and he says, if you've never missed a flight, then you're wasting too much time sitting around in airports. Similarly, I'd argue that if you never have to sell a single share of any of the stocks you own, then you might have wasted too much of your own life accruing those stocks in the first place. Well, speaking of time, some of us get started a little too late, but it's not too late to catch up. And here's a great person to share that story, Bill Yount, the co-host of Catching Up to Fi, and also the former captain of a boat named YOLO.
Hello, Jesse. This is Bill Yount from Catching Up to Fi, a podcast that I co-host with Jackie Cummins-Koski for late starters to the financial independence journey. You've asked me to come on the show and tell you a little story about keeping up with the Joneses. So I have many of those, unfortunately, as a late starter, but the one that comes to mind is a story about our boat named YOLO. And as we all know, YOLO means you only live once. So my wife and I moved from Chicago to Tennessee in sort of an incidental geographic arbitrage. We built a house in a classic Joneses neighborhood where the houses all looked the same. They were all many thousands of square feet, and it was a boating community. Now, if you're going to build or buy a house in a boating community, aren't you going to buy a boat too? Doesn't it seem only natural? The good news is there was 200 some odd properties in this community and only 32 boat slips. So it was a hot commodity. We got in on the ground floor, and thankfully, in addition to buying a boat and naming it YOLO, we bought a boat slip. So we went on to enjoy this boat. Our kids were growing up, and in high school, we had their friends over. We went tubing. We went wakeboarding. We truly enjoyed the memories that this boat provided us with. However, one day, we were out lounging around as the sun set and the waters were calm, and we were heading home at the end of a long day in the sun. And I opened it up wide open and proceeded to run across a rocky shoal and crashed YOLO on this shoal. Luckily, we did not sink, but we required a very embarrassing tow all the way home. Now, what do you do when you crash a boat? Well, of course, you have full replacement insurance, and you take that money and you buy another boat. Actually, you buy a bigger boat, and that's exactly what we did. Now, luckily, we bought used and didn't buy new for these fun but very depreciating assets. Actually, I wouldn't call them assets at all. They're liabilities. What is the definition of a boat? It is bust out another 1,000. What is the best day of a boat owner's life? Well, it's the first day or the last day. These are things that are holes in the water in which we fill them, and they're going to sink your finances if you're not careful. Now, we had them for the memories, and our kids think fondly of the times that we had the boat. But after the crash and upsizing our boat to the next level Jones's boat, we called it Rocky Bottom. Because what happens to YOLO when YOLO crashes on a rocky shoal? Well, you end up with a rocky bottom. And we live in Tennessee, where we proudly sing the song Rocky Top. So Rocky Bottom I found to be a very unique name for our next level Jones's boat. The boating life ended for us after a handful of years. It had its season in our life, and our kids went off to college. We became empty nesters. The boat sat on its slip, gathering dust and requiring maintenance, ongoing, of course. And eventually we decided, okay, we need to sell. The good news is, in spite of having to have all the gas, carrying costs, maintenance, a motor, engine overhaul, my wife had the foresight to have us buy the slip as part of our foray into this keeping up with the Joneses community. That slip appreciated remarkably in the 7 years that we lived in that house and in that neighborhood. And thankfully, all of the carrying costs, all of the maintenance costs, all of the motor rebuilding costs that we had incurred in owning the boat were covered by the cost of selling the asset of the slip. So what are the morals of the story here? Well, first of all, buy utility and rent luxury. Did we really need to buy a boat? Probably not. Did we feel that we needed to buy a boat for our kids and having the pressures of living in a boating community? Well, of course we did. Where you live is where you eat, who you socialize with, and the cars start to look the same, the people start to look the same, and if you upsize the neighborhood in which you live, your lifestyle is only naturally going to upsize. So buy utility and rent luxury. Could we have rented a boat that we use 10 to 12 times a year? Absolutely. Did we need to own one to do it? No, but it did give us naming rights. Buy assets to pay for your luxuries or liabilities. This is what the wealthy do. You can afford the car if you have assets that are covering the cost of this. The boat slip was what saved us in our boating journey. And what we did do with this, however, is we bought experiences, we bought memories. So was I a happy boating owner? Yes, I was. Would I do it the same again? Maybe, but I might have given it some more thought. And without buying the slip, it truly would have sunk our finances with the sunk cost and the opportunity cost lost in paying $16,000 to $20,000 for a boat and then $25,000 for a slip that in the matter of 5 to 7 years appreciated to $55,000. So it was nice in the end that all these costs were covered. But guess what? So we sold the boat, we sold the slip, we covered our costs, but then the money went into building a hot tub in our new home. So go figure, different neighborhood, different Joneses. Remember the morals of the story. Buy assets to pay for your luxuries and liabilities. And you don't have to keep up with the Joneses. You can stay ahead of them if you're monitoring your finances and prudent with your purchases. Thanks for inviting me to be on the show, Jesse. I hope this has helped your audience realize that they too don't have to keep up with the Joneses. Take care, Jesse. We'll see you soon on Catching Up to Fi, I hope. And thanks for the invitation to be on your show.
Rent your luxury and buy utility. And another way that I've heard that is rent your fun. So, owning a boat, owning a snowmobile, owning a ski chalet in the mountains 5 hours away from where you live, those are luxuries. And it seems like, 90, 95, 99% of the time, the sentiment you hear from the people who own those luxuries is that it's just not worth the effort or the costs or the time to actually own those luxuries. I've shared on my blog and the podcast before that one of my biggest and dumbest spending mistakes of my adult life involved both sides of that sentiment, actually. So a group of friends and I, we rented our luxury by taking a long weekend trip to Lake Placid in the winter, stayed at a little cabin in the mountains. That cabin had a hot tub. And if you've never spent a snowy mountain night with good company in a hot tub, it's a pretty cool thing to do. So coming off that weekend, I decided that I needed to buy a hot tub. And I did. And I spent too much money on it, and I never used it as much as the initial cost would have merited. And when I sold my house in 2023, I very intentionally kept that hot tub sitting right there at the old house. But whether we have a little money or a lot of money or something in between, the habits in our spending life play such a vital role. And Jeremy Schneider, founder of Personal Finance Club and founder of Nectarine, he built decades of habits being a borderline broke entrepreneurial startup founder until he sold his business for $5 million. And this story that he's about to tell just goes to show that habits usually don't shift as quickly as our life circumstances do.
Hello, long-term investors. This is Jeremy from Personal Finance Club. My frugality journey is a little bit different than most. I spent most of my 20s and early 30s living like I was still in college, very, very frugally. I was starting a company that I started out of college, but we were bootstrapped. And so I was always paying myself the least of anyone at my company. My max take-home salary was $36,000 a year. And so I was just trying to live on as little as I could to put as much into the company as I could. And so for a decade plus, I was living basically with extreme frugality until something really great happened in my mid-30s when I sold my company for just over $5 million. And so I went from being borderline broke to being a multimillionaire with the click of a refresh button on my bank account website. But, those habits that had been ingrained in me for 15 plus years didn't stop overnight. I became more of a aficionado of investing. I was putting my money away. I was growing my wealth. My share after taxes of the company sale was about $2 million, but over the years that grew to about $5 million. And one day, as a multimillionaire with a net worth of $5 million, I was flossing and I hate flossing. And I had this little piece of floss that was about 8 inches long, and it kept slipping out of my fingers and just made it this frustrating thing. It had always been so frustrating to me. And I stopped and I asked myself, why am I using such a small piece of floss? And the only answer I could come up with is to save money, because that's what I'd always been doing, because I didn't want to waste, when I was trying to pinch every single penny I could in my earlier years, I wouldn't want to waste these huge pieces of floss. So now as a multimillionaire, I was still trying to floss with an 8-inch piece of floss. And it was literally negatively impacting both my behavior and my mood, because I was getting frustrated, and my health. My gum health was suffering from not flossing as much as I would otherwise, because this was such a frustrating experience. And, on that day, it kind of snapped that I could just pull out yards and yards of floss and wrap around my head and around my body and just bathe in this stuff, and it wouldn't even be a rounding error on any of my bank accounts. And so I started using much longer pieces of floss, and it's just a funny example of how money decisions and spending decisions are often very ingrained in us from either our childhood or our young adulthood, and we do things because the way it feels or the way we've always done things. And even when there's evidence staring you in the face that it's not good for your life. And so on that day, I decided to start using longer floss. I now floss more often. My gum health has improved, all good things. That's my story of frugality. This has been Jeremy Schneider, and you can follow me for more dental tips on Instagram at Personal Finance Club.
Listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode. I'd love to know what you think of this specific episode, because if you've been listening for a long time, you've probably seen that I enjoy some experimentation with episode formats, whether it's the AMA episodes, the simple fact that I start most episodes with a monologue before the interview, or fun experiments like this one. So let me know if you enjoyed it. As always, please send your questions to my email, jesse@bestinterest.blog. These are awesome ways we all get to learn together. A rising tide, it lifts all ships. An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. So thank you for listening to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.